welcome to the Scots Whay podcast. In this edition, I talked to Louise Welsh about her latest novel, No Dominion, which is the final part in her Plague Times Trilogy. The first novel of the trilogy was A Lovely Way to Burn, and I think that was roughly about 5 years ago, to be followed by Death is a Welcome Guest. And as a fan of both those books, I've been looking forward to No Dominion for some time. There will be a full review up on the website shortly, but the short version is anyone else who's been looking forward to it will not be disappointed. It was great to have Louise back on. I think the last time she was on the podcast, it must be about 3 years ago, talking all things Empire Cafe. Yeah, 2014, that'll be about right. So I will say no more. I will let you listen to the lovely Louise Welsh, and I'll see you on the other side of this. Hello everyone, and welcome to another Scots Whay podcast. And today I'm joined by one of our favourite guests who we haven't seen for a while, Louise Welsh. Hello, Louise.
Hello.
We're here to talk about the publishing of No Dominion, which is the final book in your Plague Times Trilogy. But before we talk about No Dominion, I think it'd be good to have a little story so far. How did we get to No Dominion?
Well, the Plague Times Trilogy is a contemporary story about a pandemic. So it begins in London with A Lovely Way to Burn, and at the centre of that first novel is Stevie Flint. And Stevie works for one of these shopping channels, you know, where if you switch it on and you find yourself with your credit card in one hand and the telephone in the other hand, you know you're in a bad place. So Stevie sells this kind of stuff, what we used to call swag when I worked on markets, things that nobody really needs, you know, but you have a lot of it. So you sell this stuff cheaply, but she's doing it in a more high-powered way. A plague hits the world, I guess, and we don't know how many people it wipes out, you know, but it's a high-octane, frenetic story, and the story is partly about the death of Stevie's boyfriend, who is a doctor, and it asks the question to a degree, what happens when something like the NHS becomes completely unvalued? Big Pharma can make a lot of money through drugs, and there's opportunities for corruption. So there's a couple of, as usual, there's a few plots on the go, and it's set partly in these labyrinthine medical places, you know, it's set in hospitals and so forth. A lot of scenes on the underground in London, a lot of tucked away places, but really starting in one of the big world cities of our time. The second book, we don't really see Stevie in that book until the end, I suppose, and at its centre is an Arcadian comedian, which rhymes nicely, and his name is Magnus McFall. Magnus has lived in London for a long time. He's on the eve of what may be a big breakthrough. He doesn't know. I guess the action in that book runs parallel to the action in A Lovely Way to Burn in terms of time. Magnus, when the plague hits, when the sweats, the pandemic hits London, is incarcerated. He's in Pentonville prison. And the question is, what happens if you're locked up when the plague hits? It also occupies the world of religious zealotry.
Yes.
So these two characters are each introduced in the first two books, and in the final book we see them in the same place.
Yeah, that's how I kind of think of them. You know, I think of A Lovely Way to Burn is Stevie's book, Death is a Welcome Guest is Magnus's book, and now it's their book together. If you say that they're the kind of heroes of the piece, for want of a better word. When we spoke before about the kind of things that had inspired the trilogy, I remember you mentioning programmes like Survivors and Threads and things that an impending, particularly nuclear holocaust was ahead. And then what I felt was within Death as a Welcome Guest, there was influences of things like maybe the Wicker Man and the Crucible and the Children of the Corn. In terms of No Dominion, was there anything like that you touched upon that was influential, did you feel?
I think certainly all of those influences are still there. You know, that idea of what happens when the world goes awry, when things are really out of kilter, and still thinking about people like H.G. Wells, John Wyndham, you know, the Day of the Triffids. All of these things really play into my mindset, I think. I guess also it might sound a bit silly, but this is a book that travels across Scotland. So there are quite a lot of Scottish influences. Still thinking about Edwin Muir, who I've thought about since the beginning of this book.
Interesting.
And that poem, which a lot of people studied at school, I came to it much later, but The Horses, I think that's an amazing poem. But also Muir's Scottish journey, the way that he's travelled through the landscape. I'm doing the journey, a truncated journey and in reverse. But the book's underpinned, I think, by socialist principles, as Muir's work is as well. And also Kidnapped, that running through the Scottish landscape, which is a book that I've always loved, and I've always loved the way that Stevenson doesn't really do a lot of description of landscape, and yet you see it in your mind as Alan Breck and David Balfour hurtle through it. So, you know, this is me looking retrospectively. I didn't sit down and think, I want to draw on Kidnapped, but thinking of it afterwards, those influences are maybe there.
I think that's really interesting, because Stevenson doesn't do that. He doesn't go into great detail about every nook and cranny and hill, but you do absolutely get a strong sense of place. And I think it's the same particularly in Orkney, where this begins, No Dominion begins. Now, I've never been to Orkney, but you immediately get the sense of this small community, because it's now a community of survivors, I suppose, who you know are trying to keep themselves separate from the mainland, and whatever is still, you know, horrors are still going on there. And it's things like the entertainment being round one small pub, and the fact that they're someone will go up and sing a song, and that the children are now teenagers. It's little details, and even that the Stella is now out of date or things like that. You think, well, it's a community that's been together for a while, but there's still a sense that they're feeling their way with each other, and a fear of what might come from the outside.
Absolutely, yeah.
And is that what you wanted to build, the fact that we'd moved from London, we've moved through the country, you know, ever moving further north, and that perhaps the safest place to be in this situation, not only as an island, but the very most remote island that you could get to?
I think so. I think I chose Orkney for many reasons. It's a place where I've never lived, but I've been to many times. As you say, there's a remoteness there. I do think if you're going to set something somewhere, set it somewhere that you want to go. Set it somewhere that you want to research. And so to go to Orkney to research this was a pleasure, really. But also I wanted islands. So the Orkney Islands, Orkney itself, mainland Orkney, has a lot of people on it.
Yeah.
And it has a good infrastructure. It has ferries obviously arriving from all over the place daily. It has flights coming in daily. So I wanted somewhere that previously had this good infrastructure and a decent sized population, and yet, you know, like the rest of the world, like London and Beijing and all of these world cities, it's now reduced to just a few folk. And I did think that remote places, physically remote from centres, because of course nowhere's remote if you're there, that people might gravitate towards it for those reasons of safety. I wanted that slight contradiction, and also a place that you can feel the ancient world there, you know, because the archaeology is so amazing. So we have the stones of Stennis and Scarabray and Maes Howe, and you know, these places that you can feel that connection with the past and with past civilizations that have lived and disappeared. And in this book, the civilization that we're living in now is one of those civilizations as well. It's gone, much to the sadness of the people that remain.
Yeah, I think it's something I think that's run through all three is, what happens when society begins to break down. And you're saying in the second book, fundamental religion came into it. And then you've also got some of the older belief systems, going back to the idea of, I guess it's, again, referring to a lot of Scottish literature from the past, but the reverting back to the land and the sea and the positives and the negatives that come with those. Now, it's quite a few years, is it 7 years after?
Yes, 7 years since the last book, but in the fiction.
Yes, in the fiction, yeah. Could you say a bit more about how the community on Orkney has come to be the way it is? Because you've got the children and you've got adults, and they are from the outside families, but then you start to learn a bit more about how these families were put together.
Yeah, I guess but there are no blood relations left.
Yeah.
So the plague has been such that there are no husbands and wives who came through the plague together, who came through the sweats together. So any relationship is a new one that's developed since then. And the same goes for most of the children. All of the teenagers have been orphaned, and each of them is looked after or fostered by people who weren't, so this idea of relationships being rather new. Of course, when you're a child, 7 years is rather a long time.
Of course,
so
yeah.
So if you're 5, or that feels hopefully like your blood relatives. These are strong relationships, but there is a kind of, what would you call it, a discontent amongst the children who have become teenagers. And teenagers,
disconnect is not unknown.
Yeah, exactly. It's a natural thing, and it's a natural thing at that age to kick against. But the children are also kind of furious about the technology that's gone. They're furious that the adults experienced and knew this technology, stuff that we all take for granted, and yet they don't know how to reproduce it or how to fix it. And to the children, this seems a bit careless, that they never took the time to find out about how the internal combustion engine works, or how the internet works, or all of these great things.
Yeah, I think there's a lovely bit right at the very beginning where they talk about educating the children, and I mean, you can only really educate people in what you know. And of course, this is a generation that might have started to use technology but doesn't know how it works, certainly,
No.
So and you've got a generation who, if things hadn't gone the way they had, and if the sweats hadn't occurred, it would have been second nature to them to use these things. So they can teach them a little bit of of English and language and anything that they have, a little bit of music here and there. But really, what they want is the new stuff, the things that were just they would get to know, and then that was taken away as well.
All gone. And I guess that's the part of my love letter to hear, to now, that we have these wonderful things, we have these great things, and sure, some of it can be used badly, but when we think of the way the internet can bring people together, bring communities and interest groups together, help knowledge find each other, and advance things wonderfully, or even just help you send a recipe to your friend.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or keep in touch, across the seas. It is a wonderful, wonderful thing, and yet it may as well be magic, for all that I know about how it works.
Yeah.
And I think I do use it quite casually, and if it breaks, I go to the shop and ask somebody, if they would mend it for me.
I wondered if, I guess in island communities, there was always that desire, maybe not always, but particularly maybe in the last 50, 60 years, to want to go to the bright lights in the big city, to want to maybe at least try the promise of something better being not on the island. And maybe, it happens everywhere where people say, I want to leave home. But to some that might be just into the centre of town rather than, leaving behind an actual island space or somewhere where it's not as easy to get to as it might be elsewhere.
It's true, I think, and yet when you go to islands, you will find that people there are very well travelled, of course, you know, and for somewhere like Orkney, people go all the way, you know, it's not much, but there's just the sea between you and America, really, isn't there? You know, and people, I've just finished my term as president of the Ullapool Book Festival.
Yeah.
Every year they have Canadian writers, they have such a strong connection with Nova Scotia. So, you know, there's Canadian connections, American connections, connections to Norway and the Scandinavian world. So I think for us coming from the Central Belt, we can go to these places and think, oh, how remote, but actually they're connected in real and actual ways. In terms that that we perhaps don't realise on the first casual viewing. There are great travellers there. And yet, I thought as well about George Mackay Brown, and I can't remember the quote exactly, but he says something like, you know, if you stay where you are, what you need will come to you. And he's a man who doesn't really travel widely, comes down to Edinburgh and stay, you know, to work. He's what's that college just outside Edinburgh that people can go for further education? Is it Newbattle? Is it the one?
I'm not sure.
Well, Edwin Muir's the headmaster there at the time, so there's that connection. But George Mackay Brown doesn't travel much out with that, and he gets one of these great scholarships. He's one of these great travelling scholarships, and he takes the money and he goes to an Orkney island that he hasn't been to before. He's not interested in going to Beijing or something. So there's probably both exist, don't they? And that idea of being content where you are and finding your themes and your stories there is a great one. Maybe all you need to do is look at the same square of grass and you'll find all of these stories, and yet for other people they have to set out before they can come back.
I think I was just considered there was this, perhaps it was a stereotype at the time, but that there was a drain of youth from the Highlands and Islands. And I think that in some ways is reversed a bit, but certainly there was a fear among the communities that, you know, people would leave and perhaps never come back, and then that would be, you know, we know the histories of some of the islands that they just could not survive. Yeah,
and I wonder how much that's economic as well. You know, because we have there are particular villages. That I remember one in Lismore, which was completely tied to the lime, which at that point they needed for cement, which of course you need to build all these fantastic tenements that we have in the Central Belt. But when the lime industry goes, when that technology changes, this village is no longer needed. So some places exist for a finite time, don't they? But maybe all that new technology that we're talking about is enabling people to have all sorts of other businesses and other lives in places that are geographically remote from where we are just now. Not everybody has to go to Edinburgh, Glasgow, or Aberdeen, or Dundee, or whatever.
Publishers can set up, and you know, why not? Or anyone can set up a business and do that.
Yeah, and that acceptance, or you know, of the newcomer as well, because there's a wee bit of swapsies going on, isn't there? People coming from the Highlands and Islands down to the Central Belt and elsewhere, you know, across the world, and people coming from elsewhere and going to the Highlands and Islands, and that seems rather healthy.
The other thing they're talking about, knowledge and skills, I suppose, is that when there is a reconnection with the mainland, one of the things that comes up is what skills are valued and what perhaps, if hard labour has to be done, who do you put to hard labour? And then you've got the people who have, perhaps even they were old skills, like how you mine, how you farm, how you do all these things. And the people who are, you know, computer analysts and all of, you know, hairdressers and things like that. When society breaks down, these no longer become as important as they once were.
Oh, I take issue with the hairdressers. I still need a good haircut. Or beard trim.
I guess what made me think about hairdressers was in a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where the middle ship that's sent off first, and they say to start a new planet, is the one with, I think it's hairdressers, phone hygienists, and someone else with middle management, and yet the other two ships, that the top people, they stay and they send these people off
to set up for them.
to set up.
Yeah. Well, I guess Magnus himself. Magnus is, as I say, an Arcadian, and he's come from a family that do know how to do things. And Magnus doesn't want to do that stuff, but he can do it when the chips are down. And by the time we meet him in the final book, he's reinvented. He's embraced this. He can keep stock. He can fish. He can do these quite important things that have become very important just to stay alive. But I guess perhaps it's an expression of how useless I feel. The skills that I have are not actually, when the chips are down, I wouldn't be that I could write a story about what was going on, but I don't know that it'd be so helpful. And I remember meeting an Inuit guy many years ago now in Canada again, and him saying, he was a poet, good poet, and he said, well, my father could fish and make a house and do all these things, but me, I can write a good poem. I can write a poem about it. And he, I think, was thinking about going back and trying to learn some of these skills that he felt he'd let go. And then he'd probably write some poems about them.
But then you've got Stevie, as you say, who worked on the shopping channels and did these kind of things. And she, by the time we meet her again at the beginning of No Dominion, is the president of the Orkneys.
Yeah, well, that's it, isn't it? Some people, come the moment, come the man or woman, and she's found herself. And there's she doesn't, it's hard for her to feel triumph in that, because of course the way that she's found herself is because so many people died.
Yeah.
So there's an uncomfortableness there for her. But as you say, in Orkney, in this book, they're trying to make a democracy, a kind of equal society, and that's not easy to do. It's not easy to do because everybody's different. People have their own interests. Not everybody embraces equality, but of course there are many different ways of being.
What struck me was, though, she discovers through, I think particularly latterly in the first book, that she can deal with violence quite well. She's pretty good at looking after herself, which she didn't realise until being forced to kind of confront this.
Yeah.
And it comes through again in No Dominion. She can look after herself.
Yeah, and it's I think of Stevie as being quite a moral person. She is moral, but she's also a survivor, a real survivor. And there's an uncomfortableness with surviving, isn't there? Yeah. Some people...
There's a guilt that goes with it.
Yeah, and even if you're somebody that... a natural disaster happens, you're standing in the right place and you survive through no effort of your own. You just happen to be standing in the right place, and people around you weren't, and they died. But Stevie's an active survivor. She's somebody her will to live is very, very strong. And she's somebody that's killed to survive.
Yeah.
And so that, now that she has time to reflect on it, in the moment she doesn't have time to reflect on it, but after the event she does. And she's not necessarily triumphant about that.
She's not absolutely.
Happy. Yeah. So she starts off as somebody who's gym fit, and she's also a salesperson. She's got the power of persuasion,
yes.
The gift of the gab. And these are things that help her to survive. But underneath it all, there's a morality. And there's a couple of points in this book where she does, one point in particular, where she does something to survive. And it's morally problematic what she does. So that idea of pushing people and seeing that you will do things that are morally problematic in the moment, I think probably applies to most of us.
I think, again, a theme which runs through all three books is this idea of what happens to an idea of a shared morality when society is breaking down like this, where are lines drawn and then redrawn, and it particularly hits home, I think, in terms of No Dominion. There's a couple of relationships, now I don't want to spoil things, so I'm not going to go into too much details, but The first one I'm thinking of, it's almost as if someone is being used as, for that popular term now, handmaiden. You know, she's been introduced to a situation where her potential is in no way equal to the people who have bought her, basically, who have bought her. And then we have Ivan and Briar when we get further on in the book. And you have an older man and a younger, and we don't know her gender. I don't think we ever do with their gender. And I don't know how much I can say about that without spoiling anything. So, but I was interested because you have Marcus's reaction to both relationships there, and he is reacting in the standards or the rules of what was in place before the Sweats came along. And I guess one of the questions that the reader asks is, how does that change when, you know, the usual situations don't apply anymore?
Yeah, well, I think we always have people who are stronger who prey off people who are weaker, and you know, and that often is people who aren't old enough to know that they're being preyed on, and we see that going on, you know, in our society as well. And I think very much when things break down, young people are very vulnerable. You know, they're vulnerable anyway, but when you don't have people to look out for you, and when the rule of law breaks down, and you see it, you know, in the migrant camps, or the so-called migrant camps, you know, things like that. Young people are disappearing all the time. Young people are getting taken away by people who promised them a good life, or even just some kind of comfort, actually. And we see it with homeless people, young and, you know, and perhaps a little bit older, who, horrible, people offering them beds for the night, but there's a price, you know, so these things go on in our society as well.
Oh, of course.
And I guess part of what I wanted to think about is the forms of exploitation that would take place, and how they manifest themselves. And I guess that's allied to the idea of the structures of society. So we move from the democracy, a fledgling democracy, which is very on shaky feet, you know, already it's on shaky feet. And we see different forms, so feudalism, anarchy, despotism, and the idea of slavery is, as we get closer and closer to the cities, and this idea of re-establishing technology and some kind of comfort. The lack of technology is part of what leads to exploitation. So we have sexual exploitation, but also just the exploitation of labour. And that idea that some people are regarded as being of more use just toiling in the, you know, than and that this is just the new world order. And how do we feel about that?
And the justification that comes behind it to say, no, we are now offering something that, no matter how bad it is, it was better than what they had before. And you think, well, that's no justification, really. Yeah,
and it's a justification that's always used, isn't it? You know,
is,
and we hear it here if you're buying. But it's hugely complicated.
Yeah.
But the only I remember we did an Empire Cafe event with Aidan McQuaid of Anti-Slavery Alliance, and Aidan said something very wise. You know, he said, we can talk about boycotting Primark or don't buy this or don't buy that. He said, but really what we need are new structures. And, you know, if it makes you feel better as an individual, sure, boycott, that's fine. That's okay. And it did, you know, helped hugely in South Africa and things.
Yeah.
But actually, of course, what you really need is a new structure where these things are not allowed to happen.
Yeah.
And I guess this is a structure in this book where it is allowed to happen.
Because I thought of issues of slavery and particularly of refugees, the idea that the promised land that you have seen, whether it's in films or on television or in adverts or whatever, would make you go through the worst dangers to get to the promise of that. Mm-hmm. And that in itself is an exploitation. That is being sold something that is really never achievable for the people that will come over if they make it as far as that. And that's what I thought about in parts in what happens in the second half of No Dominion. Now, we can cut this if we don't want to. Can we say we finish in Glasgow? Is that all right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So were you always going to... I'm interested in how far ahead you were working. Were you always going to finish in Glasgow?
Yeah, the geography was always, from the very first book, that was the geography of the journey. So to begin in London, to travel kind of Middle England, some vague spot in Middle England, and then to start the last book in the Orkneys, and then to come down to Glasgow, back down to the Central Belt. And again, I guess the idea of the post-industrial city was quite important to me. That thinking about Glasgow in its geographical form, we're settled here because it's a fertile valley. It's a valley next to this river, but also the industrial wealth of Glasgow coming again partly from this river, this widened and dredged river that has that connection again with going to America, and the Caribbean, with the slave trade, with the blockade runners, with keeping... So all of that stuff was kind of important. And I guess also, one of the reasons I wanted to set it in Orkney, as I said, is because I like going there. And Glasgow's the city where I live. I love living here. Lived here since 1985, and I don't know why it would be my delight to walk around the city and imagine it devastated and derelict, but somehow it was. To walk through the St Enoch Centre and think, how would this be if everything fell apart? All of that stuff.
Have you seen the film called Doomsday?
No.
I must lend you a copy. Now, Doomsday is something happens in Scotland and they rebuild the wall, but they put it all around Scotland. And then after a certain period of time, folk are sent back in to check that everything's okay. And they go into Glasgow and they go along, now, which street is it? West George Street. Anyway, going up towards Goma. And then you've got Queen Street Station, and it is overrun, and just to see those, and it's a terrible film, but to see those scenes of Glasgow being, as you say, desolate, and it's quite interesting to see.
There's something, there's something very beautiful in desolation, but only in the imagination.
Yes, yeah, because partly you have all these amazing buildings, which the city chambers itself is an incredible centrepiece to have for anything like that.
It is, and we both remember when you did still see sort of bomb damage, didn't you? You did see those big gable ends with the wallpaper and the pictures practically still on the wall, and big gap sites, and Glasgow doesn't always look after its architecture in the way that it does. We can all think of beautiful derelict buildings, the facade is there, but not much else.
I wondered if, and I think you've maybe answered this already, but the reason for bringing it back to Glasgow as well is the kind of political history that it's had, but then that's almost being used as justification for what's going on. Like you have what the people who are in charge might argue is, well, look, everyone's got a job, and make sure everyone's got a job and they're looked after, and everyone is, in inverted commas, fed, and all of this, where actually, the bigger picture is there is exploitation, from the top to the bottom.
Yeah, I guess, and also I guess that's part of it, that sort of so-called benevolent dictatorship. There's not very much benevolent about it when it comes down to it, and I think things like being able to picture it very clearly in my mind's eye, being able to see George Square and all those demonstrations we've gone to in George Square, and there's a pleasure in using your own city.
Absolutely.
And you hope that people who haven't been to the city can imagine it in their own way. But
I think you do that very well. Again, there's directions of you go down there to the river. You don't go, you go down this street to that street to do that. You go down there to the river, and I mean, obviously I know it, so I can kind of work my way out. But I think if you came to start in George Square, you could probably work your way around, and you would certainly find your way to the fish market or to anything like that, for instance.
I guess it's that Stevenson thing, and I'm trying increasingly to leave space for the reader. You leave enough, but you don't fill all the space, because then people can't. They need to invest with their own imagination, which is part of the wonderful immersive thing about reading, isn't it? That you construct it, you build it, you see
exactly.
without even knowing that you're doing it. It's a wonderful exercise in the imagination.
Now, is it 5 years since the first book? Is that right?
Something like that. I have very little grasp of time. So I think it's 5 years. Yeah.
The reason I ask is because I don't think there's not been many 5 years periods where the world has changed quite as it has in the last 5 years.
I know.
I mean, how did you, when you came to write No Dominion, did you think, well, do I take that on board, or do I leave that aside, or what did you, I mean, whether it's politically or even in terms of technology or things like that, it's just changed so incredibly.
The technology, not so much, but the political situation, it did. And I was in New Zealand I was on a fellowship in New Zealand when Brexit hit, and Zoe Strachan, my partner, and I, who were both there. And thank goodness we'd both done proxy votes. We did have our friend Carol voted for us, because I would have felt very bad if we hadn't managed to put her vote down. We voted to, remain in Europe, obviously. So it was a bit of a surprise, a big surprise. That, I guess, and the American election, I did what I always do. I listened to the radio through the night on the, in the headphones, and I heard the Florida vote, and then you knew, So it took longer. It took me about 6 months longer than I'd anticipated to write the book, and I had to change things. And I think what I realised, or what I feel just now anyway, is the cyclical nature of politics, and that we're part of I think when I was very young, I used to think we were part of some sort of political Darwinism, that things would get better and better and better, and I sincerely believed that there would be a revolution. Sincerely, that's what I thought. And now I don't believe that. I think this politics are cyclical. And that's, I think, worked its way into the book.
And is that, obviously it's affected by economics, but is that the main thing it's affected by? Or do you think it, because the extent of what happens, the extreme of what happens in the books, where, things fall apart in every way because of this plague, you think, well, how extreme do you have to get before a revolution would kick in? And maybe it would take something as extreme of this, with people actually having to physically fend off people in the streets, or to be imprisoned without any evidence, or to literally fight over food. Now, all of these things are actually happening to a greater or lesser degree, but would it take something as extreme as that for...
I don't know. And I guess, the last thing I would want to see is people fighting on the streets.
No, I absolutely.
Or something. But no, I think the cyclical nature of politics and other things in society might just be down to a really simple thing. We all die. We die at about differing things, but 60 to 80, let's say. And then there's a new generation, and the memory goes, and so people go through the same things again, and you realise that we respond to the generation before, but we perhaps don't think so much of the experiences of the generation before them. So our grandparents' generation. So a lot of wisdom is lost, and we repeat actions in different ways.
That's fascinating. I think there's something really interesting in that, and to we'll haven't got time to talk about it on this, but to work out, where the cycles have happened. But I absolutely see what you mean by that. And I suppose it goes back to the teenagers in the book who are now deciding that they're maybe not wanting what their parents want for them, and that there are other things there and there are also other events that mean that they are dissatisfied with their situation on Orkney. But it's like you were saying, your teenagers hit a certain bit and you almost expect there to be what have you got? What are you against? Well, what have you got? That kind of James Dean, Marlon Brando thing.
Yeah, and that's necessary. I was driving along the motorway the other day and I saw this young deer, and I thought, why is it down there? But I think it was possibly because it's coming up to that point where the bigger deers kick the younger male ones out of the group, the herd. And then you end up on the side of the motorway, and you have to go off you have to go off and form your own herd somewhere. But I think one of the things underpinning this book, and the reason that Magnus and Stevie leave Orkney, they go in search of the children. The children have left. The children have gone off on they don't know what, with some strangers, and the reason that they go on this quest is to search after the children. Oh, that's one of us.
That's okay.
That's one. The call from beyond. But the children, they go in search of the children, and that is because of love.
Yeah.
And that's really, I think, what underpins the book, and maybe that is the constant, if we're lucky in life as well, that love is this great saving thing, and it's a great motivator as well.
I think if the first book and in the second book there was hope, at the end of both of them, even though things seemed really bleak, there was the hope that there was a future, and perhaps we were going to have to find that elsewhere, but it was there. And I think you're right here, the driving force is love, and which takes different forms. It's not just love for children, for kids, but it's for friends, it's for companions, all sorts of things, and that drives particularly Stevie and Magnus to, it's the story about the person that finds the strength to lift the car off their child if something terrible's happened, and just that kind of strength that they have that perhaps previously they would have thought that they wouldn't have had.
Yeah.
And it's great to see that hope and love has survived all of these the last 5 years, because it got me thinking when I thought, well, the changes that have happened, and we've had a series of votes that for many people, myself included, and perhaps yourself, have gone absolutely contrary to what we would have expected. And you think, for a writer, how does that change your kind of ultimate worldview? Do you think, well, I have to recalibrate not just political but social and moral, or do I still stick with the beliefs that I've had all along?
Yeah, it's strange, isn't it? Because I think, were we to go over to America and just speak to people that had voted for Trump, we wouldn't agree with them. We really wouldn't. But we would probably find out that a lot of them, well, they still love their children.
Yeah.
They still love their dog. They disagree with us on many things. So there's still, I guess it's the racism that we can't there's and I guess that's the other thing, forget about love, who do you hate?
But for me, the hope lies in the individuals, and it's the individual relationships and the individuals who are heroic. And the problem becomes when it's the bigger, the greed, or I can get this amount of money if I do these terrible things. And when it becomes bigger and faceless, then that's where this, as you say, justification comes in for saying, well, it's okay because it's a group of people and they do this and the result is this, and in the end it's for the greater good, for want of a better thing.
Well, that's
that terrible term.
The greater good.
But actually, when you break it down to how individuals act in the book, often there are as many heroes as there are villains.
Yeah, and I guess the thing is that there are people that are behaving really badly as well, and they're putting their self-interest first, and and sometimes lying to them. There's people that take economic advantage, people who are selfish, people who, I'm thinking back to Briar and the kind of sexual exploitation there of an younger person by an older person. This person can say all they want that it's okay, but actually it's unequal. And I think maybe that's what it comes down to, that anything that's really unequal is not all right, I guess
that's right.
Yeah, and in any long relationship, there's times when your partner pulls you up, and there's times when you pull them up, and you stumble along the road together, and so you hold each other up at different times. But that's a form of equality. But with this, it's not okay.
Yeah. So, having come to the end of your trilogy, how do you feel looking back on all three? Do you even do that?
Relieved, yeah, because there's points, this is my 8th book, and I guess part of it is a challenge to yourself. Can you sustain a world over 3 books?
Yeah.
And I wasn't sure that I'd have the stamina. So I'm pleased and relieved to get to the end, and that's about it, actually.
Yeah. You weren't going to do that again? I take it
I won't continue this beyond this world. Certainly the devastation of that kind of world still appeals to me, and it's one that I've lived with in the imagination for a long time. So maybe there'll be a short story, but not with Stevie and Magnus, not with the Sweats, not in this world. It would have to be a different type of devastation. I'm working on libretto just now for Stuart McRae and Scottish opera, and that's not set in an apocalyptic world, although it has its own bleaknesses at points. And I'm thinking about, I don't know if I'll do it or not, so it's another challenge. Thinking about going into the world of non-fiction.
Oh, right.
And I'm thinking about doing something about the death of the author. So 100 author deaths, interesting author deaths. But we'll see. I've not muted this. I'm just going to...
Too soon. Enjoy finishing.
I'll just... you always need to be playing around with something, so I'm going to play around with this, and I've got some essays to write and things. But I've got a novel in mind, but I think I won't start it for 6 months or so.
I'd like to mention before we finish is the collection you worked on, the Ghost Story collection.
Oh, yes.
You must have loved putting that together.
Loved it.
100 stories, is that right?
Yeah, 100 ghost stories, and it's just called Ghost 100 Stories to Read in the Dark, which just made me laugh so much because you can't read in the dark. But
I hadn't thought about that, yeah.
I did that with Head of Zeus Publishers, and I just loved it. It was... because to put 100 stories together, you had to read so many more. I didn't keep tally of how many. And I start with Pliny the Younger, and I end, I think, with James Robertson, with a story that he'd written in the year that I was putting it together. But there's a great deal of, balancing to be done in a big book like that. And I wanted to think about gender, representation, subject matter. There are different things that make us scared. And different intersections, quite a few intersections with sci-fi and fantasy, and political things come in again. And of course, length. Because if you have the book too big, then the spine breaks. So we had to have quite a strict word length. And it was also a book, as I made it, I kept on having to stop. And I don't believe in ghosts or the supernatural. I just don't. But... my unconscious clearly does, because as I put it together, I'd have these horrifying dreams, really devastating dreams, really alive dreams about ghosts and things. And I would have to stop for a week and then come back to it.
Wow.
But I've now got a massive collection of books and ghost story books and all of this. It's a world I'd like to go back to it in some way. I'm not quite sure how, but I loved it, and I loved the way that politics goes through these stories. They're often about marginalisation, and there's particular points, where, like during the suffragette campaign, you find a lot of the women that are writing these stories are suffragettes, or the ways that governesses, in the Victorian era, that these people that are in the in-between are the ones that are liable to be ghosts or see ghosts.
Yeah.
And I think maybe this has helped to bring me to the idea of the death of the author book, because each story I had to do a little 50-word bio of the person that had written it, and I realised what I was interested in was anything stupid, that happened, but also the way that they died. I always seem to put in, they died in this way or they died in that way. And one of the devastating things, of course, I arranged it chronologically. You've got to arrange it in some way. So I did it chronologically. And one of the devastating things was to get to the early 20th century and have, killed at the Somme, killed at the killed, all the deaths through war, and you saw the ways in which people died. So it sparked my morbidity, which is probably there already. So this new book, if it happens, may come out of that book. Everything leads you to something else.
Yeah. Well, that sounds fascinating, Louise, and thank you again for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
And we'll be back soon with someone completely different. Thank you. And that was our podcast with Louise Welsh, and I hope you enjoyed that. We will be back very soon, so thank you again for listening, and we'll see you then. Cheers.